Good Friday is perhaps one of the most difficult times in the church year for those of us who live in North America. We have experienced very little oppression, if at all. We probably don't know what it is like to be persecuted or to have our lives at risk for speaking out against, you know, politicians or religious leaders or anything like that. And so to sit in the moment of Good Friday and the brokenness of Good Friday, the devastation and the darkness of Good Friday is really counterintuitive for us. We are a people who expect that our wants and our needs can be met in an instant. And to have any sort of suffering is to be avoided at all cost. And so we jump from Friday to Sunday. We say things like, well, it's Friday, but Sunday's coming. We skip the grief to get to the joy. We skip the crucifixion to get to the resurrection. We don't want the difficult work of Good Friday to really make us sit down and pay attention to what's going on around us. Instead, we want to get to the celebration. We want to skip the earthy parts of Jesus's ministry to get to the heavenly parts and whatever that might entail. And so Good Friday is one of those really difficult moments for us, especially as perhaps white North Americans, especially, to sit down in the moments of grief and despair and to really pay attention to what's going on in the story of Jesus. I want to read a couple of poems for us that might help kind of situate us and then draw us back into the story of Jesus. These two songs are poems, really, but the first one is written by Johnny Cash called Hurt. It was a song that he wrote in the latter part of his career and the latter part of his life. And I think it provides some good reflection for us on one spectrum of society. And then the other one that I'll read is called Strange Fruit, which was a poem that was then popularized by a song that Billie Holiday sang called Strange Fruit. And so that will kind of situate another part of society, in particular those who are experiencing oppression and marginalization. And so let me read the poem Hurt by Johnny Cash. It says, I hurt myself today to see if I still feel. I focus on the pain, the only thing that's real. The needle tears a hole, the old familiar sting. Try to kill it all away, but I remember everything. What have I become, my sweetest friend? Everyone I know goes away in the end. And you could have it all, my empire of dirt. I will let you down. I will make you hurt. I wear this crown of thorns upon my liar's chair, full of broken thoughts I cannot repair. Beneath the stains of time, the feelings disappear. You are someone else. I am still right here. What have I become, my sweetest friend? Everyone I know goes away in the end. And you could have it all, my empire of dirt. I will let you down. I will make you hurt. In this first poem, Johnny Cash is talking about his life and that he has pursued a lot of things that he thought would satisfy, things that would anesthetize him to the suffering in his own person, but also in those around him. And in the pursuit of building up his own name, his own identity, and building up his own riches and resources, he has found at the very end of all things that this has just become an empire of dirt. It is nothing, it's worthless. And the brokenness and devastation that is left in the wake of his life is something that has grieved him deeply. The crown that he thought he was wearing just turns out to be a crown of thorns, a crown of suffering. And in that way, he has become one who has yelled out, crucify him, crucify him. And I think in so many ways, we might begin to identify with what Johnny Cash is writing here, that in so many ways, we pursue things that may seem like on the surface, they will satisfy and help us to move beyond pain. But what it has created is a devastating wake in our path. We have broken relationships and we participate in a broken society. And because of that, we have become like silly jesters sitting in a throne, but it's a make-believe throne. It ends up being an empire of dirt. it leads to nothing but death and devastation. And so at the very end, all that we have to offer, like Johnny Cash says, is something that he wishes he could trade away and go back and begin to fix things, but things that are beyond now his repair. So that first story situates, I think, the story of the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders, and the Roman Empire, who are hearing this person of Jesus as he's coming into Holy Week, being celebrated and paraded as the incoming king, this king who will deliver. And Jesus goes to the temple, not to the palace, but goes to the temple and cleanses the temple. And he pushes them out and says, this was to be a place of prayer, a house of prayer for all people, all ethnicities, all nationalities. This was to be a place of prayer. But instead, you have turned it into a den of thieves, a den of robbers. This is the moment, the culmination of Jesus's ministry, Jesus cleansing the temple and saying, your worship has become like dead, dry bones, a sepulchre, a grave, a tomb of emptiness, nothingness, vanity of vanities. Your worship has not led to justice. Your worship has not led to neighborliness. And therefore, your worship is false. Your worship is broken. It is nothing but a tomb. It is full of death. And so he cleanses it. That is the moment where the religious leaders decide to kill Jesus. That is the defining moment where they have now locked in. They are going to kill Jesus. This is going to happen. This is the moment where things speed up in that process. Then Jesus has this meal. We call it the final or the Last Supper with Jesus and his disciples. They are celebrating the Passover meal. And if you remember the Passover, it was when Israel was in bondage in Egypt, living as those who had been enslaved by Pharaoh. They are celebrating this moment, but it isn't a happy and joyous moment. It is one of fear and trembling, of waiting and anticipation of deliverance, not really sure what's going to happen. It is a dark night where they are ready to run as soon as they are given the signal. And so they prepare the meal hastily and they eat quickly. But this is the moment that they are delivered out of Egypt, out of slavery, out of bondage. That meal continues to have significance and importance in the life of Israel. It is a reminder that God is the one who delivers, and it is also a reminder that they are not to become yet another Egypt on the history stage. But as we know, if you watch the kings, including Solomon, who becomes sort of the pinnacle king in this movement back towards Egypt, Solomon embodies the way of Pharaoh and embodies the way of Egypt and the way of oppression. He begins to take the women, the young men and women, and utilize them for his soldiers and his armies that he's continuously building up and up and up. He is, in some sense, the first arms dealer in the Middle East. He becomes this great arms dealer. And not only that, but he has all these women that he continues to use for his own means. And so he begins to enslave his own people for his own pleasure and desires and for his own, empowerment. And so Solomon becomes this kind of moment of both the movement upward and then the movement downward. Things become worse and worse and worse. The kingdom splits after Solomon and everything begins to fall apart because Israel has lived as just another Egypt on the world stage, becoming an oppressor, especially of those who are the most vulnerable in society. And so by the end of this, God comes to Israel and says, what do I care about your festivals? They are nothing but empty rituals that have become a way to not deal with the things that I've asked you to deal with. What have I asked you? I've asked you to become a people who are merciful and just, who care for the orphan and the foreigner and the poor and the widow. That's the kind of people I would desire for you to be, not a people who just simply are claiming to follow me, but a people who live and embody this way of life and not the way of Egypt. And so Jesus sits down with his disciples to celebrate this meal and to remember that the church is also not to become just another Egypt. In other words, they are not to play the power games in the way that the politics that are often operating in our society operates. The church is to be something different. And in fact, Jesus takes this moment at the very end of the meal to wrap a towel around him and to take a basin and a pitcher of water and begin to wash his disciples' feet. He takes the place of a servant. He condescends. He comes down. He begins to serve those who have followed him. And in this way, Jesus says, you are to be a servant to one another. This is the great mandate, the great command that Jesus gives on that night. You are to love one another. And as I have done unto you, you shall do unto each other, and by extension, the world. So Jesus shows this alternative way of kingdom, not to conquer over and to lord over, but rather to come down and serve. So that on this night, Judas runs out and betrays Jesus. And the religious leaders come and find him in the garden, arrest him, and take him to trial. The politics of the day and the religious leaders of the day both crucify Jesus, because Jesus has called into question the way that society has operated. It has operated just as another Pharaoh, and that's problematic. God's world was not intended to be like that, but to be one where life was generated through neighborliness. So I want to read this last poem by that is sung by Billie Holiday, called Strange Fruit. And it says, southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth. Scent of magnolias, sweet and fresh, then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the trees to drop. Here is a strange and bitter crop. This poem that talks about lynching in the South, which wasn't just relegated to the South either, but it was quite heinous there as well. This poem elicits vivid imagery of those who have been crucified by society. James Cone often would talk about the way that there was a disconnect in worship between those in the white churches that would be on Sunday mornings be worshiping, and in the middle of it have it disrupted, leave worship, go and watch a public hanging, a public lynching, and then return right back to worship a crucified Savior named Jesus. There was a disconnect between their worship and the way that they lived their lives. But Jesus should cause some disturbance as much as this poem does, because Jesus is one who is a crucified, lynched Savior. He is one who has been lynched by the powers that be, both the religious powers and the political powers. Jesus is one who has called into question the power arrangements of society and become one who is a servant, who is like those who are marginalized, those who are on the outside of power and are ultimately killed by those same powers. Now, I would like to think that things are not as bad as they were when Strange Fruit was written, but the reality is that's not true. Black and brown bodies are still being killed, and they are being killed in even greater numbers than the percentage of their population in society. There are more black and brown bodies relatively in prison systems. There are higher mortality rates in this pandemic for black and brown bodies. And there's something broken in our system. And if we are paying close attention, when we see these disparities, we should also see the face of Jesus, who was a crucified person. We should see the disparities, we should see the person, and we should also see the face of Jesus represented in those faces. And here in this moment on Good Friday, we have an opportunity to really slow down, pay attention, and listen, to really hear what's going on in our world around us, and to look at all the crosses that we have erected. and to hear our voice calling out from the crowd saying, "Crucify him, crucify him." And that we would journey also with Jesus and sit in the tomb through Sunday until that moment where we can say Christ is risen. But until that moment, don't rush past Friday. Don't rush past the grief, the challenge, the sorrow, the lament, and the brokenness that is all culminated in this moment where we say, God is dead and we have killed God.